What's up, everybody? It's Hunter Bowden with Proven Fishing. Today, special. Got 3 baits, 2 ribbon-tail worms, and then 1 that is a tiller tad made up by Charlie Tiller himself with JR Custom Lures. Charlie actually made this mold himself. It has JR Custom Lures little JR symbol branded in the back of the tail. So let's get into those baits, and I'll show you what I'm going to be throwing in the tank today. So the first one, your normal Berkley power bait, ribbon tail worm, pumpkin seed, my favorite color by them. Works everywhere here in Indiana. Doesn't matter what lake, clear, dirty, really doesn't matter. I love it. Love the color. Love everything about it. JR Custom Lures ribbon tail worm. Not sure exactly what color he calls this, but I'm going to call it the black and rainbow. So when it gets into the tank, you'll see it's got the rainbow flakes all throughout, every single color you could think of that he could throw into it. I think he threw it in there, even black flake, if I'm not mistaken, that he threw in there. But they're all your normal ribbon tails, and then the real special one, the Tiller Tad from JR Custom Lures 2. Tiller Tad is just a tadpole with a U-tail / ribbon tail on the back end of it. I'm not sure exactly what he went for, if it was ribbon or if it was just a U-tail, but whatever he did it right. The thing has crazy action. So why don't we hop into the tank and see what we got. So in the tank now is a blue and clear with a silver hair flake Tiller Tad. So we're going to jump it around and see what it does. So right there, it just stands straight back up. It doesn't matter what you do with it. Right there, just lay it on the side and it wants to push itself right back up. Like I said, it looks like a shad that wants to feed on the bottom. And then that swimming action, that tail just kicks. It doesn't matter how fast or how slow you swim that thing. This Tiller Tad was probably the best thing that Charlie could have came up with, in my opinion. And right there shows you that it wants to pick itself right back up. Try and lay it on its side, and then that tail just carries it right back up. Coming in the tank now is that Berkley power bait ribbon tail worm, Texas rig, just like that Tiller Tad was. Stands up pretty well, has some good tail action. So for any of you beginner fishermen that like to just fish this worm, it's a pretty simple thing to fish, you know. You pick it up real slow, let it sink back down, you know. Alright, just like that. You're getting a view of what it looks like underwater. This last thing going to the tank is going to be that JR Custom Lures black and rainbow ribbon tail. A little bit thicker than the Berkley. So there's that ribbon tail action that every ribbon tail has. And then there's that rainbow flake that I was telling you about that you couldn't really see in the camera, but now that it's under the light, you'll be able to see. And everything Charlie pours, so far I have not had a bad bait that doesn't want to kick itself back up. Doesn't matter what it does, that anything that he pours, the end always wants to pick itself back up. Going back to what I said earlier, the Berkley Power Bait Ribbon Tail Worm, I like it. Now that I have JR Custom Lures, I'm probably going to get away from using it just because I can get Charlie to make me pretty much anything that I'd dream of. Y'all can go over and see Charlie too on jrcustomlures.com. He'll make you anything that you want, but you know, granted, you have to give it time because it is custom. And then second thing, that ribbon tail worm from JR Custom Lures also, that's just the color that I picked up in one of the auctions. Nobody else was wanting to buy it but me. I figured, you know, can't go wrong with black in general. But now that I found the Tiller Tad, you know, this thing is going to be totally killer this year for me. I'm not sure how many people know about JR Custom Lures here in Indiana, but I do know it's something different. They tell you to throw something different anywhere you go, so you're not throwing the same thing as your buddy. But you know, me being a co-angler, this is definitely going to be something that is a game changer for me. What we rigged it up on today was the same thing as last time, that 3/0 offset worm hook, which is not how I will fish any of these baits. It's just what I had rigged up for the tank, instead of having to retie before putting it in the tank for y'all. I just kept it on there. It worked just fine. I mean, if that's all you have, that's all you got. And then that 1/4 ounce tungsten weight. Just like one of the guys in the comments, Mike Foster, go over and see his channel at Mike Foster Outdoors. Subscribe. Let him, you know, let him teach you something. He's taught me a lot just by watching his videos and talking to him. But one of the things that he had either said to me or commented on the video, you feel the bottom way better with that tungsten weight. It gives you a little bit more visual, per se, with your brain of what that bottom feels like when you're fishing plastics with that tungsten head. And then the tank, you know, it gives you that reality of exactly what you're fishing and the way that you're fishing it. So for me this year, I'm not going in blind. Granted, I know how some of the baits act because I do fish a lot of clear water here in Indiana, but then there's also a lot of dirty water and you don't know what your baits do. So getting into the tank and seeing exactly how everything worked for me is going to be a total game changer. I mean, Mike loves teaching everybody things, giving them tips. If you have any questions, I'm sure that y'all could message him and you know, he'd give you any tip that he knows and teach you everything that he could possibly know whenever he has the time. I mean, if y'all have any questions for me, I'll give you all the tips and everything that I can. Right now, I'm learning and having fun in this tank, just knowing exactly how my baits work and seeing how a lot of them actually act under the water. Like that Tiller Tad, I threw it into the water the first time just right before this video just to see how it looked, and it was totally astonishing. I did not realize how it actually worked, and Charlie did a great job making that mold and making it his own. Like I said, you know, Charlie put that JR right there on that tail. So if you don't don't have a JR on your tail of your tiller tad, you don't have a real tiller tad. It's some knockoff somewhere, but you gotta have a real tiller tad. It will blow your mind, catch you the biggest fish ever. I have a lot of people on the Facebook page telling me how well the tiller tad actually works. So if you could, subscribe here, go follow the Facebook page, go follow the Instagram, go let Charlie know that I sent you over there. Buy a few things, including, the JR Custom Lures hats. He'll hook you up with one of those. I think they're $20. All these baits work magic. It's whatever you can afford, but I would tell you, not even because I really like Charlie's stuff and he wants me to tell you this, I'm going to go with JR Custom Lures for relatively everything that I can get from him. Doesn't matter if there's, Berkley out there or Yum. All of his baits are way better than them, I think, personally. So, hopefully y'all learned something. If you're new to fishing, to YouTube, or even if you're an older person and you're newer to all this, learn something. Doesn't matter if you go out and you don't catch any fish, just learn something that day. Like I said, I'm willing to help. I know everybody else in the fishing world is willing to help. Learn something, and we'll see y'all later.